I'm Katie Steinmetz. I'm joined here by Laverne Cox, award-winning actor, producer, and activist, and Chase Strangio of the ACLU, one of the nation's leading experts on LGBT rights. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So I want to start with you, Laverne. It was about 6 years ago that you appeared on the cover of Time with the cover line, "The Transgender Tipping Point."
Mm.
Looking back, do you feel like we were at a tipping point then in terms of America's awareness and acceptance of transgender people? And if so, where are we now?
Wow. I'm not sure if I can be objective when it comes to that. There's been so much conversation within the trans community over the past 6 years about whether that was indeed a tipping point, theories about whether it was that moment was just about elevating me, or was it really about elevating an entire community? Was that tipping point in a space of just representation and not in the real lived experiences of trans people? And I think it might be that last one. I think because of Orange is the New Black, later that year, the premiere of Transparent, and I think the next year, the premiere of Sense8, we began to see a shift in visibility for trans people that was unprecedented, right? I believe that I was the first openly trans person to be on the cover of Time magazine, first openly trans person to sort of be on the cover of a lot of magazines and do a lot of things. And so we had an unprecedented level of visibility, but the real lived experiences of a lot of trans folks in our day-to-day lives were not necessarily changed. Perhaps we became even more targeted as marriage equality became the law of the land. Chase and I have talked a lot about how there have been so many legislative attacks on trans folks in state legislatures all over the country. Of course, this administration has had this obsession with discriminating against trans people on a federal level. So I think the tipping point has been with visibility and with our voices being amplified, but I would argue that the material conditions, particularly of poor and working trans people, have not significantly changed in the 6 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to echo Laverne, there's almost a way in which that moment was like a more meta tipping point in the discourse about having a more contentious trans discourse. There wasn't room for multiple threads of trans narratives really before that. And so I think you could look at sort of that moment and the aftermath of it as sort of allowing more room for trans people to contend with our existence publicly. And that came through representation, that came through naming the many modes of violence against trans communities, particularly Black trans communities. And so I think there was this sort of narrative purpose that it served, and Laverne had such a central role in shifting the representational discourse and then not allowing it to stop there. And I think that's how I think about that moment and sort of how we then move forward from 2014 into the present and future.
One thing I'll add to that is I think one of the crucial things that I think about a lot that we talk about in disclosure is that we had to change the way the conversation was being had. Up until then, particularly on TV talk shows, whenever trans people would be on television, the conversation would inevitably sort of evolve or devolve into transition narratives, surgical narratives, narratives about trans people's bodies. And in 2014, we began to insist publicly that should not be the conversation, that conversation objectifies and thus dehumanizes. And I think because we were able to change the way in which we had conversations with and about trans people, we were able to focus more on the trans humanity and then move forward. We had to change the ways in which we were having the conversation so that we can then be seen as human, or begin to be seen as human, or have conversations about what it means to see transgender people as human.
I want to come back to Disclosure in a little bit, the new Netflix documentary that you executive produced and are part of, that's very powerful. But first, the Supreme Court recently ruled that LGBT people are protected from discrimination in employment by bans on sex discrimination. It was a landmark ruling, and Chase, you were part of the team that successfully argued that case. Can you talk a bit about its significance? What changed the moment that ruling came down? And why do you think your arguments resonated with a conservative court?
Yeah, I mean, I want to take us, a step back for a minute, which is that, for years, LGBTQ people were not explicitly covered under federal law. And so the mm, architecture of protections that we built in the federal courts was through arguments that federal prohibitions on sex discrimination covered us. But that took so much work from so many people over decades. And just looking at our individual clients and the plaintiffs in these cases, they were fighting these cases for 7, 8 years, and during that time they had to relive the trauma of this deeply humiliating and painful experience of being fired just because of who you are. Two of the individuals, Don Zarda and Amy Stevens, died before ever realizing this incredible win that they were this a central part of. And so you can see the impact of discrimination on people's lives. And that was what people were fighting back against over the course of decades. And so what this ruling does is it creates even unequivocal, clear rule protecting LGBTQ people from discrimination in the workplace. That in and of itself is incredible because we've been living under a patchwork of uncertainty where some states have explicit laws, some states don't. Some federal circuits have good decisions, some don't. So people had no real certainty about their legal protections. But perhaps even more importantly, lower courts apply Title VII cases to all other federal laws that prohibit sex discrimination. So this is going to pave the way for protections for our communities in healthcare and education, in credit and housing, just at the very moment that the Trump administration was escalating their attacks in those very contexts. So this is going to have transformative effects on our communities. And in terms of why now and how did we get a 6-3 ruling from a deeply conservative court written by a Trump appointed justice, I think there's really two answers to that. The first is that the arguments were so clear and sound and righteous. The law was unequivocally on our side. Both the dissent and the majority were sort of tossing over the legacy of Justice Scalia, of who was more in line with Justice Scalia's thinking here in terms of how to apply the text of the law. But we were so right on the law, and that brings me to the other reason why we were able to win now, which is that they didn't reverse engineer an outcome and abandon principle, and that is 100% due to the mobilizing of the community in the streets over the course of so many years, and that allowed the court to actually apply the principles of the law. And I just want to say one thing, which is Laverne's presence in the courtroom that day, the presence of so many trans people in the courtroom that day, and then the visibility and organizing of so many trans people leading up to that day, and then in the 8 months that passed between argument and decision, absolutely pushed the court in the right direction. I'm certain of that because they're human beings and they respond to the conditions in the world.
To go back to that argument, is it fair to sum up part of it as you can't discriminate against someone for being gay or transgender without considering sex on the way to that destination? And therefore, it's covered under this ban on sex discrimination, which is a very clean, logical line, it seems. I
Yeah.
want
Yeah, I just want to quickly just affirm too, and also because I think there's been some confusion. It covers the full LGBTQ plus community, and I think there's a lot of language and opinion about gay and transgender, and I just want people to know that bisexual people are covered, non-binary people are covered, our community is covered, and it has massive implications for civil rights across the board. And so I just want to make sure that those who are trying to grapple with what this means really know how many people are covered.
One thing that I have a question for you, Chase. One thing I've been thinking about a lot. I'm so excited about the implications that this decision has around all federal law around sex discrimination. What does it mean in the states, right? The states that are trying to discriminate against trans children, for example. I think in Idaho, that recent decision around trans kids in sports teams, and all of the assaults that are happening on a state level. What does this Title VII case mean for that, and for for healthcare? Do people have to bring these lawsuits and have them sort of adjudicated, or is it just like this is illegal, you can't do it?
Yeah, so on the first point, states are still going to be reacting, and we see every year an escalation in state legislatures around anti-trans bills. And so ultimately what that means is we're going to have to keep fighting. So the ACLU has a lawsuit with Legal Voice and the ACLU of Idaho already challenging the anti-trans bill that passed in Idaho. This will certainly bolster our arguments, and having Supreme Court precedent on our side is helpful, but the forces against us are aggressive, and we're going to continue to see these laws in the states. So we're going to have to stay vigilant and proactive. So that's going to be ongoing, but we have the wind in our sails, so to speak. When it comes to the rules that the Trump administration has put forward, all of those have been premised on a notion of discrimination because of sex that the Supreme Court has now rejected. That said, the Trump administration is not about to just throw up their hands and abandon their discriminatory impulses, because they are aggressively coming after us. So we still will have to ensure that the law is properly followed and that they don't exceed their authority under the statute. But there are already so many cases in the lower courts raising these questions in other contexts that we are positioned to ensure that they are stopped in their efforts, and that this decision gives us absolute clarity that they exceeded their authority under the statute in promulgating the anti-trans healthcare regulations and proposing the anti-trans shelter regulations. So we are ready to fight, and this 6-3 decision from the Supreme Court absolutely will have a huge impact on our ability to win.
Work.
Thank you, Grace. And and thank you, Laverne. I appreciate that. There are two, you both have spoken about visibility, and I want to come back to that on two levels. One is coming back, Laverne, to Disclosure, the new documentary that you're part of, that looks at the history of how transgender people have been depicted in film and TV, which has generally been extremely problematic as villains or victims or the butt of jokes. Can you talk a little bit about where you feel Hollywood is today? How much better is that representation on screen now than it was for a very long time?
I mean, I think if once folks see Disclosure, it's very clear that we've come a very long way. But I always like to cite the study that GLAAD did a few years ago that cited that 80% of Americans claim to not personally know someone transgender. So that means that everything that most Americans know about or learn about trans folks comes from the media. So that means that the 100 years or so of disparaging, negative, stigmatizing representations of trans folks have had real implications in the lives of trans people. I think what we've seen change in the past several years is that more trans folks are actually involved in telling our stories in the media, right? That more trans actors are playing trans roles. Now we're seeing in fiction, particularly in television, more trans writers, producers, directors behind the scenes telling stories. That makes a huge difference. And I think because of social media, more trans people have a voice, and we're able to sort of amplify our voices with social media along with our allies. And so our voices have been amplified in ways that they haven't been before, where we are in social media. So I think that there's something very exciting about that, but there's so many more stories that need to be told. There's many more hearts and minds that need to be changed so that we can have real liberty and justice for our trans people all over this country, because we're a long way from that.
Thank you. And that brings us to another example. There have recently been large demonstrations, thousands of people coming out to highlight violence faced by Black trans women. What has it meant to you to see people coming out to explicitly say in the street, en masse, Black trans lives matter? Chase, can we start with you?
Our movement was started by Black and Latinx trans women, and people who are sex workers, in rising up against state violence. And that is our legacy. And that is the legacy that I think of every day in my practice. That is the legacy that I know allowed me to be here today and benefit from all of the privileges that I benefit from, that other people fought back against systemic oppression. And so to see 15,000 people or more show up in Brooklyn to rally for Black trans lives, to me, that is the direction that we should be headed in. And that is as much, if not more, of a hopeful moment than even the Supreme Court victory.
I love your historic perspective, Chase, because I think that really, when I saw not only the 15,000 plus folks in Brooklyn, but also who turned out in LA on the same day and proclaiming that Black trans lives matter. That that moment was the result of decades of activism, decades of people who have fought before we started to fight or were even born, and that is absolutely incredible. And so that energy has to be continued. We have to remember that the fight might not be won right now, but there could be progress in a couple decades. But what groundwork are we laying right now so that in 10 years and 15 years, we can be in a new place, a place that is more just for everybody. And so, yeah, God, we come from some amazing people who've done some amazing things that have allowed us to be here. Isn't that amazing? That is something to think about during Pride Month and to remember during Pride Month. Hallelujah.
Yeah, and just we carry those histories, we carry those legacies. And so when we enter spaces, we bring all of that with us. And I was sitting there looking Justice Gorsuch in the eye, Justice Kavanaugh in the eye, and I was holding our ancestors. And I knew Laverne was behind me. And that is why we need trans people in trans spaces, because we know our histories. And if we don't, we're in the process of uncovering them, and we can bring those into spaces. And we have so many incredible historians within our community who are teaching us, like Tourmaline, S. Riley Norton, other people who are doing the labor to uncover our past, and then we get to share that as part of being alive.
Susan Stryker as well, who's also featured in
Susan Stryker,
Disclosure.
yeah.
Can I just say one last thing, that how exciting it is for me, just thinking about this landmark decision at the Supreme Court, and that Chase, a trans man, got to be on that legal team that took a case all the way to the Supreme Court, the first case involving transgender civil rights to be argued before the Supreme Court of the United States, and won. That is such an amazing, incredible thing. I applaud you, Chase. I applaud the entire legal team for all the plaintiffs. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I think our nation should be celebrating these folks right now, and so let's celebrate them. Thank you, Chase. Thank you to your entire legal team. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, we came out that day, and just one last thing, because Amy didn't live to see this decision, and she died with the hope for a better future. And I know that one of the most meaningful experiences of her life was coming out of the Supreme Court after having to relive the trauma of her firing year after year after year, to being supported by Laverne, and then hearing hundreds of transgender people outside the court chanting, "We love you, Amy."
Mm.
And it was, I mean, we were both there, and it was just something I will never forget. And I know she held on to it, through her life in this fight, and asked us all to carry it forward. And so I'm certainly going to do that. And I'm just, feel so blessed to be in this fight with Laverne and so many other people.
Thank you both so much. I think you demonstrate a kind of solidarity that is very hard to erase and very hard to ignore. And it's been really wonderful to have you with us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much.